The prairie stretched endlessly beneath a merciless sun, a land painted in shades of dust and silence, where even the wind seemed weary of its own voice. Jacob Thornton stood at the edge of his weathered porch, a solitary figure carved by grief and labour, his gaze fixed on the horizon as if it might offer some salvation. The land he had once nurtured now cracked beneath his boots, every blade of grass brittle as bone, every breath a reminder of drought and loss. 3 years of solitude had hardened him, yet beneath the calluses and the stern line of his mouth lingered a man who had once known tenderness, who had once held love like a fragile flame. That flame had been extinguished with Martha's passing, and though time had marched relentlessly forward, his heart remained buried with her. Still, survival pressed upon him, and survival demanded a companion. Not beauty, not romance, not dreams, only another pair of hands to share the relentless burden of this unforgiving world. The letter he wrote bore no poetry, no promises of passion, only the plain language of necessity. He asked for a woman sturdy of spirit, plain of face, unburdened by vanity or the illusions of softer living. He asked for someone who would not awaken the dangerous stirrings he had vowed to bury forever. Jacob believed he had safeguarded himself with words as simple as the boards of his house. Yet fate, sly and unrelenting, often laughs loudest at the careful plans of men who think themselves immune to longing. He prayed in the quiet hours when coyotes sang to the moon for a wife without beauty, without grace, without the power to unravel the walls he had so carefully built. But prayers, when born from fear, are rarely answered as one expects. Weeks later, on the dusty platform of a town that had long ceased to welcome him, Jacob stood waiting, heart steady, mind braced for the plain woman he had summoned. But when the train hissed into silence and she stepped down, time itself seemed to falter. She was not plain, she was not ordinary. She was a vision draped in modest attire that failed to dim the radiance she carried, eyes the color of honey touched by the sun, lips that needed no rouge to tempt, and a grace that turned whispers into a storm around them. Beauty, the very curse he had sought to avoid, had come to him in the form of Emma Foster. And with her, an ache stirred in his chest, half forgotten, half feared, wholly dangerous. In that moment, Jacob understood what he had truly invited into his life. Not simplicity, but complication. Not safety, but risk. The woman who now looked at him with guarded eyes carried secrets of her own, shadows that rivaled his own loneliness. She had fled something, perhaps someone, and chosen the wilderness of his heart as her refuge. The crowd murmured, their judgments sharp and swift, but Jacob heard only the quiet thunder of his own pulse. And what he had asked for was survival. What he had received was a test of desire, a chance to rediscover the very thing he had sworn never to feel again. The prairie, vast and merciless, had just offered him its greatest trial. Not drought, not wolves, not the suspicion of neighbors, but the healing temptation of love disguised as fate. So began the story of two broken souls who believed they sought nothing but endurance, only to find themselves standing at the threshold of something far more dangerous and far more beautiful. A story of longing stitched into hardship, of passion hidden within silence, of love daring to bloom in soil scorched by grief. And if, in listening to this tale, you feel a flicker of warmth, a healing light pressing gently against the corners of your heart, then let it linger. These stories are meant to be shared, to remind us that even in the harshest deserts of life, something tender can still take root. If you find comfort in this journey, I invite you to share your thoughts, to like, to comment, to subscribe, so together we may keep kindling the fire of hope, one story at a time. The horizon awaited, as did the long road that would carry Emma and Jacob into a future neither of them had dared imagine, and with it the unfolding of a love both fragile and fierce, born from necessity yet destined to heal. The wheels of the wagon creaked against the rutted earth as Jacob guided the horses away from the town, dust rising in pale clouds that clung to the hem of Emma's dress. She sat beside him, posture straight, hands folded neatly in her lap, her silence a veil he could not pierce. He had expected chatter, perhaps complaints about the heat or the barren horizon, but instead she carried herself with the quiet composure of someone long acquainted with endurance. The brim of her hat shaded her face, yet not enough to hide the delicate strength etched there, eyes that seemed to carry storms, lips pressed with the discipline of someone holding back entire worlds. Jacob, who had prayed for an unremarkable presence, found himself undone by the unspoken weight she carried. It was not her beauty that unsettled him most, but the mystery that clung to her like perfume, faint yet inescapable. The prairie stretched ahead, an ocean of gold and grey, its silence broken only by the distant cry of a hawk. Jacob cleared his throat once, twice, before speaking. "It's not much," he said, his hand gesturing toward the endless horizon. "A hard life, some would say." Emma did not look at him. Her gaze lingered on the road that unwound like a ribbon of dust. "Hard lives," she murmured softly, "are still lives. Sometimes that is enough." Her words sank into him like water into parched soil, simple yet weighted with experience. She did not speak as a girl untouched by pain. She spoke as one who had already walked through shadows. The truth of it left him quiet again, caught between relief and fear. Relief that she did not expect more of him than he could give. Fear that her silence held secrets too vast to name. When at last the ranch appeared, a lone house crouched against the immensity of the land, Emma's gaze swept over it with no sign of dismay. She stepped down from the wagon before Jacob could offer his hand, her boots meeting the earth with firm resolve. The chickens scratched in their pen, the well pump groaned with effort, the garden lay brittle and thirsty beneath the unforgiving sun. She studied each piece, not with disdain, but with the calm eyes of someone cataloguing a future she had already decided to shoulder. "It is peaceful," she said at last, her voice carrying the faintest note of something that could almost be hope. Jacob looked at her then, at the straight line of her spine against the fading light, and felt a strange loosening inside him. He wanted to tell her she was wrong, that peace did not live here, only loneliness. But the words caught in his throat. Perhaps she saw something he could not. That night, as lamplight flickered across wooden walls worn thin by years of silence, Emma moved through the house with quiet efficiency. She found flour, beans, a few jars of dried herbs, and within the hour the scent of food filled the space that had too long smelled only of dust and leather. Jacob watched her from the table, his hands restless against the grain of the wood. It was the first time in years he had eaten in the company of another. The first time the empty chair across from him was not an echo but a presence. They ate without excess words, yet every glance, every shared silence seemed to stretch across the distance between strangers. For Jacob, it was both comfort and torment, this reminder of how easily life could slip into rhythm with another heartbeat near. When the meal was done, he spoke of arrangements, separate rooms, shared labor, clear boundaries. She listened, eyes steady, then inclined her head. A partnership, then. That suits me. No protest, no coyness, no illusions. And yet, when she rose and bid him good night, her voice speaking his name for the first time, something inside him cracked open. The house that had long felt like a tomb seemed to breathe again, its silence broken not by noise, but by presence. In the darkness of his room, Jacob lay awake, listening to the faint sounds of her settling in, the creak of the bed, the soft splash of water in a basin, the sigh of a weary soul finding rest. Ordinary sounds, and yet to him they were healing. Outside, the wolves called to one another, lonely and wild, but for the first time in years, Jacob did not feel wholly alone. He had expected endurance, nothing more. Instead, he felt the tremors of change, the kind that unsettles and restores in equal measure. In the quiet, beneath the weight of unspoken fears, he sensed that both he and Emma had stepped into something far larger than survival. A fragile thread had been woven between them, delicate as dawn light, yet strong enough to alter the course of their lives. And as the night deepened, Jacob understood with aching clarity. What he feared most was not the harshness of the land, but the gentleness of hope returning. The dawn would rise soon, carrying with it the burdens of labor and the whisper of new beginnings. Two strangers bound by necessity would walk into the day, carrying secrets, carrying scars, yet carrying also the possibility of healing neither had dared to imagine. The days slipped into rhythm, not of ease, but of survival, and Emma folded herself into the life of the ranch with a quiet determination that unsettled Jacob more than any rebellion might have. She rose with the dawn, skirts brushing against dust as she stoked the fire, her hands, so clearly shaped for softer work, growing calloused as they drew water from the reluctant well, gathered eggs from stubborn hens, and stitched torn seams in worn garments. She did not complain, did not flinch at the barren soil or the endless wind that pressed against every corner of the house. She moved as though each task was a vow kept, each burden an anchor against something unnamed that pursued her. Jacob watched, torn between gratitude and a growing unease, for the woman he had prayed would be plain and unremarkable, revealed herself instead as both strong and luminous, and with every passing hour he feared how easily she was taking root in the places he had sworn to keep empty. At first, their conversations were clipped, shaped by necessity. How many eggs the hens produced, which fence posts needed mending, whether the sky hinted at rain or only dust. Yet in the pauses between those practical words lingered an undercurrent neither wished to name. Jacob noticed the way Emma's eyes softened when the calves nudged her skirts, the way she brushed a hand over the brittle soil as though coaxing it back to life, the way her laughter, rare and fleeting, sounded like water rushing into a dry creek bed. He told himself not to listen for it, not to wait for it, but he did. And in the evenings, when lamplight painted her face in amber hues and she bent her head over stitching or stirred a pot at the stove, Jacob's chest ached with a longing he had no right to feel. The emptiness of the house had been filled, but with it came the dangerous sweetness of remembering what it was to want. One evening, after a day of mending fences beneath a sky that threatened rain, yet gave none, Jacob found her kneeling in the barren garden plot. The sun was sinking, bleeding its last light across the horizon, and Emma's fingers sifted through dry soil as though reading a secret written in earth. He leaned on the fence post, silent, watching her. At last she spoke, her voice low but steady. "This land isn't dead, only thirsty. With enough patience, something could grow again." The words, meant for the soil, struck through Jacob's chest like a seed finding its way into hardened ground. He wanted to tell her she was wrong, that drought had stolen all hope, but instead he found himself quiet, caught in the way her belief sounded less like a farmer's observation and more like a prayer. She stood, brushing dust from her hands, and their eyes met in the fading light. For a heartbeat, the air between them carried something unsaid, tender and frightening, before she turned back toward the house. That night, Jacob lay awake long after the coyote's cries faded, hearing in his mind her voice declaring that even parched soil could bloom again. He pressed a hand against his chest, where grief and fear had long rooted themselves, and wondered if she had meant only the garden. Emma slept in the room across the hall, her presence a steady hum beneath the silence. It should have been enough, this partnership of survival. Yet each day with her loosened the walls he had built, piece by piece, until the idea of living without her shadow across his porch seemed unbearable. He had not wanted beauty, had not wanted hope, had not wanted the healing ache of desire. And yet here she was, unasked, unplanned, transforming everything. The prairie outside remained merciless, the well untrustworthy, the sky stingy with clouds. But inside the walls of that weathered house, something fragile and dangerous had begun to grow. A partnership once meant to be nothing more than endurance was shifting into something warmer, something that carried the quiet promise of healing. Jacob felt it in the way her laughter lingered long after the sound was gone, and Emma, though she said nothing, carried it too in the way her gaze sometimes lingered on him when she thought he wasn't looking. Neither dared to speak it yet. Survival still demanded their hands. But the heart, once awakened, demanded far more. And so, beneath the vast silence of Wyoming skies, they carried their secret flame into another day, unaware of how swiftly fate would test the fragile bond that had begun to take shape. The wolves came with the deepening of summer, grey shadows slipping closer to the weakened cattle, as if hunger itself had grown teeth. Jacob noticed the tracks first, pressed sharp into the dust near the outer pasture, and that night his unease settled heavy on the porch. Rifle in hand, he kept vigil, his eyes searching the horizon where the land met the sky. When Emma stepped out, braid heavy against her back and her own rifle steady in her grasp, he felt the air shift. "Go inside," he murmured. But she shook her head. "A woman alone learns to protect herself. Tonight, we watch together." She spoke it with such quiet strength that Jacob felt something stir within him, a recognition that she was not merely enduring this life, but claiming it. Her silhouette against the stars was as fierce as it was beautiful, and though he told himself to look away, he could not. The attack came just before dawn. The wolves moved like smoke, 3 shadows flowing toward the pen where calves cried for water. Emma's first shot cracked the silence, precise and steady, dropping one before Jacob even raised his rifle. Side by side, they fought, their shots weaving into a rhythm that drove the remaining beasts back into the darkness. When the quiet returned, Jacob turned to her in awe. The sight of her, breath quick but hands unwavering, shook him more deeply than any danger could. "Where did you learn?" he asked, but Emma only looked away, her voice low. "When you have something worth protecting, you learn." There was history in those words, sharp and sorrowful, but she gave him no more. Still, Jacob felt the ground shift beneath them, as though something new had been planted in the soil of their fragile partnership. Respect had deepened into something richer, more dangerous. Days passed, and the drought pressed harder. The well grew stingy, its water muddy and thin, the cattle gaunt from searching fruitlessly for grazing. Jacob's despair grew heavy, yet Emma's eyes searched the land with patience he had long abandoned. One morning she led him to a cluster of stunted cottonwoods, their roots clinging to life against the dust. "See how these trees endure," she said softly. "Water runs deep here. If we dig, we'll find it." He wanted to dismiss her words, wanted to believe there was no hope left to wrest from the earth, but desperation silenced his doubt. Side by side, they drove the shovel into the hard ground. Sweat slicked their skin, blisters rose on their palms, dirt streaked their faces, yet Emma's determination did not falter. "One more foot," she urged when Jacob wanted to quit, and it was her hands that broke through to damp soil, her cry of triumph that rang out against the dying light. Water seeped slowly upward, precious and real, a miracle coaxed from the stubborn land. They sat at the edge of the new well, laughter spilling between them like the water they had uncovered, both filthy, both exhausted, both alive in a way Jacob had not felt in years. He looked at her then, not just at the curve of her face or the light in her eyes, but at the spirit burning inside her, fierce enough to fight wolves, patient enough to coax life from barren soil. Gratitude rose in him, fierce and uncontainable, yet it tangled with another feeling he dared not name. When their eyes met, the air grew heavy, charged with something that frightened him more than hunger or thirst. He leaned toward her before sense returned, and when a coyote's cry broke the spell, they both pulled back, their breaths unsteady, the truth unspoken. That night, as Emma moved about the kitchen, her hands deft with the rhythm of preparing supper, Jacob found himself watching with a hunger no meal could satisfy. The air between them thrummed with a tension neither dared to touch, yet every shared glance, every accidental brush of hands whispered of what had already begun to bloom. The prairie remained merciless, the sky stingy, the wolves restless. But within the walls of that house, something tender had taken root. Jacob had asked for survival. Instead, Emma had brought him the first fragile taste of healing. And though neither spoke of it, both carried the weight of knowing. Desire, once awakened, could not be locked away again. The days that followed grew heavier with silence, their partnership the same in labor, but transformed in spirit. At the well, at the table, in the weary hush of night, they circled each other like wary souls afraid of fire, yet already warming their hands against it. What they had found in the dirt was more than water. It was proof that even in the harshest drought, something new could begin to flow. Neither knew it yet, but the true storms were still gathering, waiting to test whether what bound them was only necessity, or love strong enough to endure. The storm came without warning, A September night unraveling in lightning and thunder that rolled across the prairie like the voice of God. Rain hammered the roof in torrents, drenching the land that had begged for mercy all summer, flooding the cracks of thirsty soil. Jacob had been mending harnesses by lamplight when the first drops fell, and Emma, bent over a shirt she was stitching, looked up with wide eyes. For a heartbeat, neither spoke. Then she whispered, almost reverently, "Rain." They rushed to the porch together, laughter breaking through the silence as they watched the sky open. The scent of wet earth rose rich and alive, a balm to their parched spirits. Emma stepped into the downpour, tilting her face upward, arms spread wide as though to embrace the heavens themselves. Water plastered her hair to her cheeks, turned her modest dress into ribbons of shadow clinging to her frame, but she did not care. She spun once, her laughter ringing brighter than the storm. Jacob stood, transfixed, torn between warning her inside and the sharp ache of seeing her joy burn against the darkness. When lightning cracked too close, he pulled her back beneath the roof, his hands clumsy yet urgent as he wrapped a blanket around her trembling shoulders. She looked up, cheeks flushed, eyes bright as molten amber, and he felt his resolve crumble. Drops of rain clung to her lashes like jewels. Her lips parted with breathless laughter, and before he knew it, his hand lingered at the edge of the blanket, trembling with a hunger he could no longer deny. "Jacob," she whispered, his name breaking from her as though it had always been hers to keep. He bent, instinct overpowering reason, and their lips met with the desperate force of a dam breaking. The taste of her was rain and fire, cleansing and consuming, a healing sweetness he had vowed never to touch again. She melted against him, her walls crumbling as surely as his, and for that moment nothing existed but the storm inside and out. When at last they parted, both breathless, the weight of reality pressed in. Emma clutched the blanket tighter, retreating to the safety of her room with eyes wide and shining. Jacob remained by the fire, fists clenched, trembling not from the storm, but from the truth that had just shattered the walls he had spent years building. He had sworn to need nothing but survival. Now he needed her, and the knowledge frightened him more than drought, more than wolves, more than death itself. The following days carried a new weight. They moved through chores as before, yet every glance lingered too long. Every brush of hands sent fire racing through their veins. Silence no longer felt empty. It hummed with words unsaid, with promises unspoken. Emma's eyes met his across the table, and in them Jacob saw not just beauty, but a depth of loneliness that mirrored his own. They had agreed to be partners, nothing more, yet their souls had betrayed that bargain with one kiss, and there was no unlearning the taste of longing. In the evenings, when the sky bruised into twilight and coyotes sang beyond the fences, Jacob found himself torn between terror and hope. Terror that he was becoming vulnerable again, that loving her would one day break him as Martha's loss had. Hope that perhaps, against all odds, love could be not a wound, but a healing. Emma, though silent, carried the same battle. Her fingers trembled when she folded her skirts, her lips pressed together as though holding back confessions that would undo her. The prairie still demanded strength, the ranch still struggled for life. But between them now pulsed a fire neither could smother. Jacob had once prayed for plainness, for a life stripped of temptation, Yet fate had delivered Emma, a woman who laughed in the rain, who dug for water with torn hands, who bore secrets in her silence and hope in her eyes. And with every day that passed, the truth became clearer. Survival was no longer enough. Love, dangerous and healing all at once, had begun to demand its place. The storm had broken not only the drought, but the silence between them, and though they tried to mend the walls, both knew the foundation of their arrangement had already shifted forever. The prairie sky cleared, the stars spread across the night like lanterns, and in the hush that followed the rain, Jacob understood. What had begun as endurance was turning into something far greater. What lay ahead neither could name, but the current of it pulled them forward, unstoppable as the river newly born from rain. And soon the shadows of Emma's past would rise, testing whether what had bloomed between them could withstand the harshest trials of all. The days after the storm carried a brightness Jacob had not felt in years, yet beneath that fragile joy a new weight pressed between them. Emma moved through the house with quiet composure, her hands steady as she mended, cooked, tended the chickens, but her eyes lingered on him with an intensity that unsettled and soothed all at once. At night, in the hush of the house, Jacob could hear her footsteps across the floorboards, hear the faint rustle of fabric as she readied herself for rest. The sounds were ordinary, but to him they were a balm, a reminder he no longer carried silence alone. Still, the kiss in the storm had broken a boundary they could not mend, and every moment since had been steeped in the awareness of what they had awakened. He told himself to keep distance, to rebuild the walls around his heart, but each time her gaze met his, soft and unwavering, the walls cracked further. It was Emma who spoke first of her past. The rain had long since dried from the prairie, but the air that night was heavy with memory. She sat before the fire, her hands twisting a piece of cloth in her lap, her voice quiet but firm. She told him of Missouri, of the wealthy man her father had promised her to, of debts paid not in coin but in her future. She spoke of Charles Whitman, a man who had seen her beauty not as a gift but as property, a prize to be owned, displayed, broken into submission. Her words were steady, yet her eyes glimmered with a pain she had buried deep, and Jacob felt each confession cut into him like a blade. She had fled not for adventure, not for romance, but for survival. She had chosen his advertisement because he had asked for plainness, because she believed plainness meant safety. Her voice faltered then, her lips trembling. "I thought perhaps you would not see me the way he did. I thought you would not want." Jacob's heart wrenched at her words. He wanted to speak truth, to admit that he had wanted her from the moment he first saw her, that his fear was not of her beauty, but of his own hunger for it. Instead, he rose, pacing the narrow room, his hands restless. "You should not have had to run," he said, voice rough. "No woman should be bound by another man's debts." Emma lifted her eyes to him then, a soft fire burning through her weariness. "But I did run, and it brought me here." For a long moment, silence hung between them, heavy with all that was unspoken. Jacob looked at her, at the strength etched into her every gesture, and felt the deep ache of knowing she had chosen him not for love, but for refuge. Yet still, despite everything, love stirred in him, quiet, stubborn, healing in its insistence. The weeks that followed deepened the quiet bond between them, even as the shadow of Whitman's name lingered unspoken in the corners of their days. Jacob caught himself watching Emma with new reverence when she carried buckets of water, when she worked the soil with patience, when she smiled at the calves that pressed close against her skirts. She was not the fragile ornament Whitman had tried to claim, nor the plain, invisible woman Jacob had prayed for. She was something greater, a flame that refused to be dimmed, a spirit too resilient to be broken. And in her strength, Jacob felt his own heart stirring back to life. But whispers in town grew sharper with every visit. The gossips, emboldened by Emma's beauty, speculated on her past, on the mystery of why a woman so radiant had come to the hermit rancher. Men tipped their hats with sly grins, women turned away with narrowed eyes. Jacob clenched his fists at their cruelty, but Emma bore it with dignity, her chin lifted, her silence unbroken. Yet when they returned home, Jacob sometimes caught the tremor in her hands as she unpinned her hat, the flicker of weariness in her gaze. He longed to take her pain as his own, to shield her from every whisper, but he knew some wounds could not be silenced by anger. Only love could heal them, and love, though it pressed hard against his chest, was still a truth he feared to speak aloud. The prairie nights stretched long and restless, filled with the cries of coyotes and the ache of unspoken longing. Jacob stood beside Emma on the porch as they kept watch for wolves, rifles in hand, the stars sprawling above them like a river of light. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was charged, alive with everything they felt, but could not yet confess. And though danger still prowled at the edges of their land, Jacob knew the true battle was no longer with drought or wolves, but with the past that haunted Emma and the fear that bound his own heart. Fate was moving closer, steady as hoofbeats on dry earth, and soon neither silence nor distance would protect them from what was coming. The horizon promised both threat and deliverance, and with it, the next test of what had begun to bloom between them. For the shadows of Emma's past were not content to remain behind her. They were already riding west, drawn by the very beauty she had hoped would remain hidden. The stranger arrived on a morning so still that even the prairie seemed to be holding its breath. Jacob was repairing the chicken coop when the sound of hoofbeats broke the silence, steady, measured, nothing like the tired gait of a ranch horse. He straightened, hammer in hand, and watched as a black thoroughbred emerged from the horizon, its coat gleaming with the care of wealth. The rider was a man cut from a different world, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a suit too fine for dust and wind, his pale eyes sharp with ownership. He dismounted with the ease of one who believed everything he touched belonged to him. "Thornton," he said, his voice smooth, practiced, "I believe you have something of mine." Emma stepped from the house with a bucket of water balanced in her hands. The moment her eyes fell upon the man, colour drained from her face, the bucket slipping, water spilling into the dirt at her feet. "Charles," she whispered, her voice taut with fear. The man's smile widened. "You've led me a chase, Emma, but contracts are binding and debts must be paid." From his coat he drew a folded paper, the ink sharp and cruel. "Your father's signature, $20,000, settled with you." The words struck like a lash. Emma's chin lifted in defiance, but Jacob saw her hands tremble. "I am no man's property," she said. Charles only smirked. "The law says otherwise." Jacob stepped forward then, placing himself between them, his jaw set, his voice low and steady. She is my wife. Whatever claim you believe you hold is finished. Charles's gaze swept over him, dismissive, cold. Wife? No certificate, no ceremony, only whispers of sin. You're nothing but a hermit clinging to dust, Thornton. You can't shield her from me. The man's words cut deep, but Jacob did not waver. He had lived years bowed beneath grief, years bowed beneath silence, but not any more. He clenched the hammer tighter, his voice sharp as flint. Leave my land. Charles's smile thinned, no warmth in it. I'll leave for now, but the law rides with me. Tomorrow, the sheriff, the judge, half this town will know the truth. She is mine. Enjoy your time, rancher. It won't last. He mounted his horse, his gaze lingering on Emma with a cruelty that turned Jacob's blood to fire. Then he rode away, dust rising in his wake like smoke from a burning field. Emma collapsed to her knees where the water had spilled, her hands pressed to the earth as though the soil itself might steady her. Jacob knelt beside her, reaching out, but she flinched, her eyes wild. "You don't understand," she whispered. "He'll destroy you. He has money, men, power. There was another girl once, before me. She tried to run. They found her in the river." Her voice broke, the memory twisting through her like a blade. Jacob caught her shoulders, drawing her against him despite her protests. "Let him try," he said, fierce and unyielding. "I have been a coward too long, hiding behind grief, letting fear rule my life. But you've given me something worth fighting for again. I won't let him take you." Tears welled in her eyes, spilling hot against his shirt as she clung to him at last, trembling with the weight of it all. "Jacob," she breathed, "he won't stop." He pressed his lips to her hair, voice steady even as his heart thundered. "Neither will I." The words were not loud, not boastful, but they carried the weight of vow, a vow stronger than contracts, stronger than fear. For love, once awakened, does not surrender. It endures, it heals, it fights. That evening, as the prairie sun sank in a blaze of gold, Jacob and Emma sat side by side in silence, watching the sky burn itself into twilight. Trouble loomed heavy on the horizon, yet within the hush of that moment there was a strange peace. The kind that comes not from safety, but from choosing what is worth standing for. Their hands brushed, lingered, and in that fragile touch was a promise. Whatever storms came, they would face them together. The night settled, coyotes crying their lonely hymn, but Jacob no longer felt the emptiness of loneliness. He felt Emma's presence steady beside him, her heartbeat echoing the same truth that stirred in his own. And as stars began to scatter across the wide Wyoming sky, he knew the true battle had only just begun. The town gathered long before noon, the dusty street of Willow Creek swelling with faces drawn by the promise of spectacle. Windows filled, balconies crowded, the air sharp with the hunger of gossip. Jacob walked at Emma's side, every step measured, his hand steady on the revolver that hung heavy at his hip. He had dressed with care, clean shirt, polished boots, a leather vest worn smooth by years. But it was not vanity. It was resolve, the quiet dignity of a man who had decided his life was worth more than fear. Beside him, Emma's hand brushed his, her eyes fierce though shadowed with worry. She had begged him not to fight, had whispered of flight and hiding, but Jacob had only shaken his head. "No more running," he had said. And now, here they were, hearts bound by a choice neither could undo. Charles Whitman stood waiting at the far end of Main Street, black from hat to boots, the grin of a predator stretched across his face. His fine friends lingered nearby, their pockets fat with bets, their eyes glinting with cruel anticipation. He looked every inch the man of power and menace, yet Jacob saw through the costume, saw a man too used to owning, too used to winning, a man who believed money and fear were stronger than love. The sheriff stood between them, a white handkerchief trembling in his grip. "When this falls, you draw," he said, voice heavy with warning. "Fair and final." The crowd hushed, the prairie itself holding its breath. Emma's eyes met Jacob's, and in them he found his courage. He did not see fear. He saw faith, shaken, desperate, but real. The handkerchief fluttered to the ground. Whitman drew like lightning, his pistol clearing leather in a blur, the crack of his shot echoing through the street. But Jacob moved with the instincts of a man who had survived storms greater than bullets. He stepped aside, steady, his own revolver rising, his finger squeezing with a calm born not of practice, but of love. His shot found its mark. Whitman staggered, blood darkening his shoulder, his weapon tumbling from his hand. The crowd gasped, then fell silent as Jacob approached, his gun still steady. "Finish it," Whitman snarled, clutching at his wound. "Prove you're no better than me." Jacob's voice was low, firm as stone. "No, I don't need to end your life to end your hold. You leave here today, and if you ever return, I will not miss." He drew from his coat the marriage certificate signed at dawn. "She is my wife. Your claim is ashes." The crowd erupted, some in cheers, others in mutters of disappointment. But Emma heard none of it. She ran to Jacob, her hands trembling as they touched his arm, her breath breaking as relief and love surged together. He pulled her close, his lips brushing her temple, and in that embrace the noise of the town faded into silence. They had won more than a duel. They had claimed freedom. They had claimed each other. As they left Main Street, the people parted, some nodding in respect, others whispering of legends already forming. The hermit rancher and the runaway bride had stood against power, against fear, and chosen love instead. Back at the ranch, the land seemed changed. The air smelled sweeter, the house warmer, as if the earth itself recognized their victory. Emma moved through the rooms with lightness, her laughter returning like rain after drought, her hands softening the hard edges of Jacob's solitude. Curtains fluttered in windows that had stood bare for years. Green shoots pushed from the soil she coaxed with care, and the new well flowed strong, a symbol of the life they had dug together. Jacob watched her, his heart no longer burdened by grief, but filled with the steady rhythm of something healing and whole. She had not been the plain woman he asked for. She had been more, far more, and in her he had found not survival, but a reason to truly live. That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in rose and gold, Jacob and Emma stood on the porch, their hands entwined. The prairie stretched endless before them, no less wild, no less unforgiving, but no longer empty. "Do you regret it?" Jacob asked softly. Emma leaned her head against his shoulder, her eyes glowing with quiet certainty. "Every step led me here." How could I regret the path that brought me home?" He pressed a kiss to her hair, his chest rising with a peace he had not felt since youth. The world would still bring storms, but together they could weather them. In loneliness, Jacob had sought only endurance. In Emma, he had found love, healing, and the courage to begin again. And so their story did not end with a duel, nor even with a kiss, but with the promise of mornings shared, of laughter reborn, of a life woven from hardship into hope. A love not sought, but found, a love not plain, but extraordinary. If this tale has touched your heart, if you felt the healing warmth of love blooming against the odds, I invite you to share your thoughts. Leave a comment, let your voice join ours, and if you wish to keep journeying through stories of love, resilience, and hope, remember to like and subscribe. Your presence keeps these stories alive, carrying their light into the hearts of many. Together, we remind the world that even in the harshest soil, love can still take root.